I know a little bit of Astrid's story, and it's quite amazing. I encouraged her to write it down once, and I have a copy of her book, which is great. And I'm excited to hear it today. I'm excited for everyone to hear. So we're going to listen to Astrid, and at the end, if there's a chance for kind of questions or clarifications, we can do that as well. And I know that we've had a few apologies from people who are keen to try and who wanted to come and listen but couldn't. So we are recording it, so others can watch it. But it's always better to hear it live if you can.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you also for all the kindness and care that you've shown me, and especially when I was so ill. Thank you for everything, Chris. Thanks. So, I mean, the most important experience of my life was, tell me if you can't hear me. You can hear me okay? Yeah, oh, great, yeah. The most important experience of my life was a visitation by the Lord Jesus in this room a few days before Christmas last year. And I mean, it really was a visit. It was really as though someone had come, albeit briefly, into the room. I'm not going to say more about this because it has already been, I've already described it to the congregation. I'm going to do the testimony in 3 parts. 1 is the historical background, 2 is a bit about my life, the main points, and 3 is an account of my relationship with God. And there is an invisible thread running through all this. It is God's hand, loving, caring, rescuing, helping, and guiding. So first of all, the background. I mean, I was born in 1941 and my family was Estonian. Now, for a few words about Estonia, it's a tiny country. Today, the population is 1.3 million. It's on the Gulf of Finland, opposite Finland. It has, until recent years, been occupied by a number of countries, but most notably Russia and Germany. It gained independence in 1918 and became the Republic of Estonia. So, I mean, to come up to the war years, 1938, Estonia is independent. 1939, the Russians move in. Brutality, executions, hangings, deportations. 1941, the Germans move in. Indescribable brutality. The entire Jewish population is wiped out. The Roma population are also wiped out. For cripples and the mentally ill, there is one word: euthanasia. 1944, the Russians are back. More brutality, horror, war. And all this in one of the most devastating wars of all time. My family left Estonia in 1944 as the Russian grip on Estonia tightened. I say my family, it was my mother, her parents, and my baby sister Dagmar. My father, newly qualified as a doctor, had disappeared on the Russian front. My mother thought he was dead. In fact, he'd been placed in a concentration camp and he reappeared quite a few years later. By this time, my mother had remarried and she was in the UK. I mean, obviously a dreadful situation, but I won't go into this now. Anyway, to get back to East Europe in 1945, I'm going to read a bit from Anne Applebaum's book, Iron Curtain, the crushing of Eastern Europe. So where are we? Actually, the phrase Iron Curtain was coined by Winston Churchill. In Alabama in 1946, he said, "From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent. Behind that line lie all the capitals of the ancient states of Central and Eastern Europe." So now for Anne, just to give you a brief historical picture of where I actually was. So 1945, March onwards, really, March, April, May. So she says, among many other things, the year 1945 marked one of the most extraordinary population movements in European history. All across the continent, hundreds of thousands of people were returning from Soviet exile, from forced labor in Germany, from concentration camps and prisoner of war camps, from hiding places and refugees of all kinds. The roads, footpaths, tracks, and trains were crammed full of ragged, hungry, dirty people. The scenes in the railway stations were particularly horrific to behold. Starving mothers, sick children, and sometimes entire families camped on filthy cement floors. Epidemics and starvation threatened to engulf them. So she actually describing exactly where I was, age 3.5, in a railway station in East Germany, cement floor, the whole thing. Yeah, so we had gotten a train. We'd gotten a train with the Russians shooting at the train, and now here we were living on the floor of a station. And I mean, quite literally, people were dying and so on. Anyway, then suddenly a German woman came up to my mother, and she said, "I can't bear to see you here with the children." And she took us all in. That was all 5 of us. That was my sister Dagmar, my mother, and my grandparents. And this was a family that their job was they were undertakers. However, at this point, my grandmother died because it had all been too much for her. And then my mother wrote a memoir, which I will read from to describe my grandmother's death. So my mother writes, "My poor dear mother died after 2 days. She had severe pneumonia. A doctor did prescribe tablets, but they did not help. She suffered badly, becoming unconscious. She hallucinated and turned a nasty yellow in color, and she closed her eyes forever. Ingrid's aunt was very helpful and sympathetic. I went out to buy lily of the valley flowers, her favorite flowers, but I could not get any. I returned to find that Aunt Bridget had got some. The funeral service was very touching, with a priest and a quartet of musicians, and I felt such a pain in my heart that I thought I would faint. The cemetery was quite close, and my father and I and Ingrid's aunt followed the coffin to the grave. It was a cold day, but the sun had come out, and that was comforting. The next day, I went to visit her grave, but there had been bombing during the night. A bomb had fallen on her grave, and it was unrecognizable. So this actually was, this was now I'm going to describe my first experience of Jesus, because I was present when I was present in that situation, and I can still remember it quite clearly. So I was in a dark corridor. I think I'd been told to go away. Remember, I was only 3.5. But I had sneaked out to where it was all happening. I was quite angry at being banned. I was standing behind a closed door. They were all in there, but I had been banned. Suddenly, a tall man came along the corridor. He looked at me and he said, "Come and say goodbye to your grandmother." So he opened the door. Suddenly, the room was full of light, as though filled by sunlight. My grandmother lay on the bed, propped up by pillows. I wanted to run towards her, but something stopped me. I stared at her. I knew that something terrible was happening. I was aware of Jesus' presence. It was something to do with a sort of golden light and an overwhelming feeling of peace and love. I knew that everything was all right. I felt a deep feeling of calmness wash over me. Something passed between my grandmother and myself, and ever since then, I've always felt her love flowing down from heaven towards me. It's strange, I was the youngest there, but I was the only one who really seemed to understand what was happening. I was the only one who was actually calm. So, I mean, that's my experience of Jesus, my first experience of Jesus. Well, that is one experience from that deeply chaotic and troubled time. A lot of other things happened. The war ended. We managed to get to a camp for displaced people, a DP camp, DP standing for displaced people, near Hamburg, run by UNRWA. UNRWA stands for United Nations Refugee Rehabilitation Association. I say managed to get, in fact, a polite phrase for the simple word walking. Imagine it. Either side, the rubble of bombed buildings, people dying in the street, my mother with a 3-year-old and a baby, and my grandfather carrying a heavy suitcase. So that's the end of phase 1. Then a bit more about my life. Fast forward 10 years. I am now a 13-year-old schoolgirl, and now it's all very middle class. I'm at a girls' school, James Gillespie's High School for Girls in Edinburgh. Muriel Spark was a pupil at the same school, and you may know her book, The Prime of Miss Jean Brodie. There's also a film, Maggie Smith plays the part of Miss Jean Brodie. And you may remember the phrase, la crème de la crème. Yes, I mean, we were actually told every day by the teachers, can you imagine it? At assembly, we were told, you girls, you are the crème de la crème, and therefore you have to be an example to the whole of Edinburgh. Anyway, I did well at school. I went to Edinburgh University where I read English. When I graduated, I was offered 2 postgraduate scholarships. One was in creative writing at an Ivy League university in the States, and the other was in film at the Slade. I was very drawn to Harvard, but I was seeing a boy at the time, my husband to be Francis. I asked him if he would wait for the 2 years when I went to the States. His response, his exact words were, I can't guarantee it. And so I chose the Slade. And there you see is another example of God's incredible healing power. I mean, 1 minute I'm in the depths of a hellhole. The next minute I'm granted access to 2 of the best academic institutions in the world. And it's just, I mean, this is just, it's only one example, but it is quite amazing how all the time, God is almost like a person saying, here you are, here you are, here you are, here you are. After the Slade, I went into the film world, but it wasn't for me. My real calling was actually teaching, and I specialized in dyslexia and illiteracy. I worked in a number of FE colleges, mostly at Lambeth College in South London, and also at London South Bank University. And actually, I'm still on the books at University of West London. I also worked in the upper room for 15 years. In fact, with all my contacts in education, I set up the education facility in the upper room in the very early days when John Wheeler was running it. As well as this, I worked as a volunteer in dyslexia support at Wormwood Scrubs. Francis died of cancer of the bowel in 2010. He was very interested in music, and in the later stages of his career, he established and ran a classical music label, Olympia Compact Discs, which does have quite some kudos. So yes, now for a bit more detail about my religious life. As I said, I had this experience of Jesus at the time of my grandmother's death. And I have actually felt close to God from that point on. When I was at Gillespie's, I was a member of the CU, that is the Christian Union, and we had meetings and we went to camps and also guide camps. And I also went to Billy Graham's evangelical meetings. Again, I've had so much good luck in my life, so many blessings. God has always guided me and given me more than I have deserved. Also, I've always been interested in theology, and in 2003, I got an MA in Biblical Studies at Heathrow College, University of London. That's a Jesuit college situated in the convent of St. Mary, Kensington Garden Square, sadly closed down. And that was a wonderful place to study because it was a convent, a proper convent, terribly non-politically correct, with sort of creaking wooden staircases and no health and safety, and rabbits. The nuns were fond of rabbits for some reason, and there were rabbits in the garden, and the garden was full of beautiful flowers, and it was just an amazing place to study. I mean, in one of the libraries, I sort of went down into the depths, and just lying around, And there was even something like the Doomsday Book, like something dating from 1066, huge leather, well, you couldn't have walked out with it because it was so big, but it was just sort of lying there. It was just chaos. And I'm just so sorry that, government cuts, and that it has now closed, but that was a wonderful experience. Anyway, as well as this, I've always actually felt that my interest in literature and my degree was actually a part of my religion. I feel that the best literature, great literature, has the same concerns as theology. It is preoccupied by the same questions. It explores human suffering and it discusses morality and how we should act. I mean, in John 17, for example, well, all throughout the New Testament, Jesus makes the distinction between the world as it exists and God's world. I mean, he says of disciples, they do not belong to the world, just as I do not belong to the world. And I feel that the world that Jesus rejects is the world that literature obviously rejects as well. I have a strong relationship with God, and I spend a lot of time in prayer and meditation. For example, every day at 7, I sit in this room, always for an hour, but sometimes for very much longer, and I read the Bible, and I talk to God, and I pray, and sometimes I spend a lot longer. And I have a very serious relationship with God, and I'm saying this because what I'm going to tell you now is it's playful and teasing, and I want to tell you about it, but I want you to remember that that I'm not playful and teasing all the time. That I do have I'm serious as well, and this is amazing, and it is actually a story, and so I don't know if you remember children's. Well, you won't remember Children's Hour, like 60. You do. I see Jane nodding. Yeah, there was Children's Hour, and there was always this phrase: "Are you sitting comfortably? Then I'll begin." So I shall say, "Are you sitting comfortably? Then I'll begin." So I had watched a TV documentary on the planetary system, and it was especially on the way it was thought that the planet Jupiter had developed. They were saying things like he was far out in orbit, but he moved further in and swallowed up another planet and bounced up another planet. And it was all very fascinating. So I watched this. And then later, I was lying in bed and I was thinking about this. And then I began to think about God and the creation. And I began to, I began to wonder, what was he doing what was he doing when he created the planets? What was he thinking? Was he, how had he planned it? And all this business about, these planets with the gases and the physics, it's also complicated. And I just tried to visualize it because I found it so fascinating. Suddenly, God seemed to speak to me, and he said, "Here you are, small fry," he seemed to say. And I felt that he'd thrown me down a large beach ball that was yellow and red in color. That's Jupiter color. "Play with this," he said, "and leave the thinking to the big guys." Well, I bravely swallowed the insult. In fact, I was thrilled to have a beach ball, and in particular, a beach ball called Jupiter. Jupiter really cheered me up. Jupiter really changed my life, and I had Jupiter with me all the time. I used to walk along the street, secretly bouncing Jupiter and smiling, ha, I've got a ball called Jupiter. And it was quite funny because then people on the pavement, people started smiling at me, and it was quite strange. So that was really nice. But now I'm in a very, very dark and difficult twist. So, however, one evening I was walking along the road with Jupiter, and I looked up at the sky, and a horrible feeling went through me. And I felt that something really dreadful had happened. And indeed, some days later, there was a message on my phone, go to Acton Care Home. Dagmar, that's my sister, is ill. She's terminally ill with cancer. So I have to say that we are a very sort of volatile family with lots of argy-bargy. And I was told this quite late on, and Dagmar was only about 2 weeks away from her death. So, so suddenly, I found myself alone in a room, staring down at Dagmar. She was lying on a low bed. She was unbearably thin, and she was asleep. So I stood there, Acton Care Home, sort of staring at her, and I didn't know what to do. And then God said to me, speak to her. And I said, I can't. God said, I will help you. So I moved towards her and spoke. I can't remember what I said, but she opened her eyes and she said, I love you. I said, I love you too. I have always loved you. Then a thought came to me. She is about to die. She is going to have to pass through death. I knew what I had to do. I said, Dagmar, here is my ball called Jupiter. Take it. Jupiter will help you. And I gently threw the ball towards her. She died soon afterwards, about 10 days afterwards. I didn't say goodbye to her. I said, Dagmar, always remember, I gave you my ball called Jupiter. This was March 2015. And of course, that was Jupiter, and I missed Jupiter. I really missed Jupiter. I missed Jupiter dreadfully. But there's a strange sequel. And again, I want to stress, I don't think this is religious, but it is so strange that I want to tell you about it. But don't think I'm really gullible. So anyway, one Sunday, Chris preached a sermon on the subject, Aids for Prayer and Meditation. At the end of the sermon, I realized that in the corner of the pew where I was sitting next to me, there was a tennis ball, this tennis ball. So when the service was over, I went up to Chris and I said, look, I found this. And Chris said, take it home and use it as an aid to prayer. So I did. Then suddenly one day it struck me, it's red and yellow. And suddenly I said, it's Jupiter, I've got Jupiter back. And actually I cried. And what's more, when I looked closely, I saw that someone had drawn a smiling face. Someone had drawn a smiling face on Jupiter. I hadn't noticed it. So what did I do? What did I think? You're right. I thought, I've got Jupiter back, and I've got a message from Dagmar, and everything is wonderful. But still not the end. It's still not the end. It's still not the end. So years passed. This was 2015, and then quite recently, only about 2 months ago, I was sitting as I say, I sit in this room about 7 o'clock onwards, and you can't really see, but there's a sofa. There's a sofa where Jesus is. I sit in the sofa, and there's an armchair opposite, and I sort of I have conversations with God. As well as meditating. So I'm sitting on the sofa, and I imagine God sitting on the sofa, and well, I was actually trying to imagine what happened when you die and when you've got no props. And it's quite funny because, in the psalm this morning, it said something like horses are vain. And I was thinking things like, well, it's all right in this life when you're sort of you've got your friends to lean on, you so on. But what if, you know, when you die, you've got no props at all? It's going to be so difficult. And then suddenly, God leaned forward towards me and he said, I'm giving you another ball. It is blue. It is from heaven. Me. Where is it? Where is it? God. It's on your lap. Me. Is it a beach ball? God. Yes. Me. What happens when I stand up? God. It will follow you like Jupiter did. So, of course, I called it blue ball. And blue ball has been amazing. I mean, really amazing, really amazing. It's very, very different from Jupiter. I mean, Jupiter was great fun, and Jupiter made me very happy. As I said, I used to walk along the road pretending to bounce Jupiter and smiling, and people smiled back at me, and I sort of loved it. But blue ball is very, very different. Blue ball seems to be slightly in front of me, and it really has changed my life. It has made me more proactive and challenging. And I think people who know me would probably say that I've become quite sharp and much sharper in the past 2 months. It's got me to do things that I shy away from as well. Come on, it seems to say, just try doing it. Do a little bit. Just start and do a little bit. Come on. And yes, actually, I have achieved a lot in the last 2 months. And I also feel that I've been much more upfront and challenging. I'm no longer afraid, as I was, of offending. I speak up and I contradict people. And basically what Blue Ball has said to me is, I don't care what people think. I've got Blue Ball, I'm invincible. That's it. That's it.
Oh, that's brilliant. Thank you, Astrid. Well done. What a fascinating testimony. It's so good to hear your faith journey and the joy and playfulness of God. I think that's really powerful. And I think it's a testimony to us all to shake us in our own nice, neat boxes that we often put God in, especially in our Anglicanism, you know. And,
yes, but I am serious. I'm serious too.
No, I know you are. I know you are. And I know, and I would say I would completely agree that the last few months, you know, last couple of months of your ability to be like, I think we should do this. And
yeah,
you know,
I've been
being proactive with like the garden and all of that, and your generosity, all of those things, I've been like, wow, Astrid's really, you know, so I would agree that obviously the Lord is doing something and manifesting this kind of blue ball thing, that he has his little playfulness with you. It's great. It's great, Astrid. And I think it is a challenge to us all to be more playful. And, you know, as Christ challenges us, he said, you know, your faith should be like a child, you know, and just accept and trust in him. So thank you, Astrid. And I think that all of us can learn something from what you shared tonight.